Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 4 of the American Pageant titled American Life in the 17th Century from 1607 to 1692. We're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry, the content's going to be the same. To start off here, the key concepts for this chapter, these are basically going to serve as the takeaways, and they're located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. What I like to do is after I read the chapter, I match the key terms to each bullet point, and this will really help you organize information, so I highly recommend you do it. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the labor system in the colonies. You should note that in the South, there's a tobacco cash crop economy, which creates a demand for a reliable workforce. And there are a couple problems with this. For one, you have African slaves who were way too expensive and had high mortality rates because of the Middle Passage, which we'll talk about in a bit. There were also the natives who died too quickly on contact with the whites because of disease. Remember back when Columbus first arrived, he accidentally brought over smallpox and it decimated the native population. So just like that, the natives weren't really that useful to the colonists. And you should note that whites couldn't work themselves because of the low birth rate. Especially in the South, we talked about in the last chapter how it was mostly a male-dominated society. Individual single males would come by themselves. However, in the North, families would tend to immigrate, which is why there were more people to work the land, a higher population in general, and it's also why they didn't really rely on slavery because they could just do it themselves. So again, the whites had to rely on the slaves to do the work. And you see a solution to this with indentured servants. These were poor whites from England who paid for transatlantic passage to the colonies in exchange for working 4 to 7 years under a master. So essentially they were like temporary slaves. They were working for X amount of time, then they would be set free, they would be given some small earnings to go and start a new life. And indentured servitude became really popular with the headright system. Essentially what would happen is the masters would be given 50 acres of land in exchange for paying for a poor white's journey to the colonies. And this would really encourage the importation of indentured servitude because masters would also benefit by getting more land. And you can see how you have two sources of labor. One is in England, they're coming to the colonies as indentured servants, and from Africa, the Middle Passage, which killed thousands of slaves who were forced to stay in these unhygienic conditions under the ships, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But first, let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. This was led by Nathaniel Bacon, and it was essentially these disgruntled, freed, indentured servants who were forced to move westward in search of work, but to no avail. And conflict with the natives inevitably ensued. The natives didn't like that the white settlers were encroaching upon their land, but the whites kind of had no other choice, and this will continue to be a problem for decades. It won't really ever get solved per se, it just gets progressively worse. But aside from that, going back to the rebellion, they were further upset because during this conflict, they weren't really getting protection from Governor William Berkeley because he was profiting off a monopoly that he had over the Indian fur trade. So the deal was with the Indians that he would get a portion of the money over the Indian fur trade and they would be protected. He didn't really do much to help the indentured servants. And this rebellion was so drastic that people realized that indentured servants weren't a reliable source of labor. And it leads to an immense shift from indentured servants to slavery. So now the Middle Passage is really going to take a toll on slaves. And the shift in labor is really aided by the fact that the Royal African Company loses their monopoly over the slave trade in the colonies. The colonies are going to have a booming internal slave trade now. And the Middle Passage, which we mentioned earlier, continue to have high mortality rates, as high as 20%. You can see how the slaves were kept in these tight quarters under the ship. To say it was cruel is an understatement, but it was truly brutal. But it wasn't as high as before. Obviously, these slaves were considered property to them, and they didn't want to lose money on their investments, so they had to make sure that the mortality rates were very low. They wanted to make sure that most of them came through it alive. As a result of this shift to slavery, you get these very harsh slave codes, which we talked about in the earlier chapters, with Britain implementing these in the West Indies. These are going to come to America, and they essentially created distinctly different statuses for servants and slaves, specifically inferior to whites. For example, slaves and their children would be property for the rest of their life. They weren't allowed to be educated, really just stripped of very fundamental rights. And these were blatantly racist motives. To some extent, it could be argued that they were for controlling the slaves and making sure that they didn't escape or run away or what have you. But some of these were just blatantly white superiority, white supremacy, nothing having to do with the fact of controlling the slave. It's really just for the whites to feel as though they were superior to the slaves. So let's talk a little bit about resistance and religion during this time. And in terms of religion, you have the Congregational Church. This was a very democratic, Puritan church without the hierarchy that was characteristic of Anglican churches, which is relatively common with the colonies during this time. They are really putting their own twist on traditionally British things. And during this time, you should also note that there's a waning religious zeal, which leads to more lenient rules for church membership. It's more inclusive. Remember, the church, as we talked about in the northern colonies, was for the elect, for the specifically saintly, holy people of society. And so because of that, people weren't really enthusiastic about trying to achieve this ideal that so little people had achieved, and as a result, they didn't really care for religion anymore. And you can see this with the Jeremiah. This was a form of sermon that warned parishioners of their impending doom due to their loss of religious passion. So people at first were kind of enthusiastic about religion, but now they're not, especially when they're being criticized all the time for it. And finally, the churches compromise and they create the halfway covenant. Essentially, the church gave partial membership rights to those who didn't consistently come to church. And soon, anyone could come to church, which blurred the lines between everyone and the elect few. So they used to be pretty exclusive, but now they're starting to be a little more lenient. And another thing you should know about that doesn't really relate to resistance or religion is the Salem witch trials. Essentially, women were accused of being witches and were killed. And it often came from families famous in Salem's manufacturing economy, while accusers were often associated with the poor subsistence farmers. So again, you're seeing this widening wealth gap and fear that commercialism would eclipse religion in importance. And unfortunately, women were the scapegoat for this. And you see again how this wealth gap is affecting the colonies with Leisler's Rebellion. This is a conflict between aspiring merchants and the New York elite. And it was one of the many uprisings that occurred as some of the elite tried to replicate the European hierarchy in the colonies. And it really shows the growing class tensions between the rich and the poor, which aren't going to be stopping anytime soon. This is really just the beginning of that. And then finally, just a couple things you should know about the Northern way of life. Really is just for your own knowledge. People came to the North as families, not just individuals, which is why, as we talked about earlier, the North had a higher population than the South. They often had many children, which, again, gave them a greater population over the South, which will come in handy during the Civil War. But that's for later. And there was also a constantly changing weather. It really went to the extremes, especially in the cold, and it allowed for a diversification of income, so it was not just an agrarian society, had to find other ways of making money. And that'll do it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions, and please like and subscribe. It really helps us out and lets us know that this video was helpful for you and helps us make more videos in the future.